Hello dolls and welcome back to another video. Today I want to do something I have never done before. I want to give you a fashion review of a movie. I feel like ever since A Great Unknown, the Bob Dylan biopic came out, everyone is talking about it, and I really wanted to take a look at the fashion designs and the costume designs of the film because I really like the costume designer and it is just such an interesting time period. It only focuses on 4 years, so that really much narrows it down, and I really wanted to share my opinion on it as someone who first of all has a background in movies. I used to be a prop master, so I feel like I have a good idea of what goes into a production like this. And then also as someone who has been dressing 1960s and 70s inspired for the last couple of years. I think I'm going on like 7 years or so of doing this. So I feel like I do have a lot of knowledge about the time and I really wanted to share my opinion on this with you. So yeah, I have my cup of coffee, I have all my notes, so let's go and immerse ourselves into the wonderful world that is A Great Unknown. Also, I saw Bob Dylan in November of last year. I absolutely adored it. I feel like he's so great on stage and it was such a wonderful evening. So ever since I have been listening a lot to Bob Dylan, I was in such high anticipation of this movie to come out. And I do have a lot of thoughts and feelings about this. This is not a movie review though. I just feel like compared to a lot of other biopics, because it only focuses on this really small time period, it does go a lot into detail. However, for me, it could have been 10 hours longer and way more detailed. But yeah, for those of you who haven't seen the film yet, it focuses on Bob Dylan's life from 1961 to 1965. So it is very much about the period where he came to New York, started out, and then went electric. That is kind of like the major plot point of the film. I found this particularly interesting because Bob Dylan is still alive and he has had this massive career ever since the early to mid 1960s. So where do you start, where do you end? But I do like that the film only focuses on these couple of years as it really has the time to go into a lot of details. I feel like the general conflict of the film is about Bob Dylan going electric and his folk fans not liking it, and I feel like this is such an interesting point in the story and in his life and his like way of being an artist, because I feel like a lot of people, once they get famous, especially musicians, with one kind of music, they just stick to the genre. And so for him to make the move over to the electric kind of music did change a lot in the music world. And it also opened the doors for other bands and artists to do the same. So I really don't want to go into too much detail and tell you like the whole story of the film because you can read about that online, and then also, I mean, obviously you still want to go and watch that film, but it kind of like starts out with him coming to New York, his early beginnings. He meets Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and they really like him and his music. He also meets a girl called Sylvie, which is really clearly Sue's Rotolo. I did a little bit of research because I found it kind of odd because everyone else just goes by their regular name in the film. However, I found out that Bob Dylan didn't want the production to use her real name, and so they renamed Sue's character with Sylvie. However, from my understanding and like reading about Bob Dylan, this is pretty much the same person, they just changed the name. She's also played by Elle Fanning, which overall I felt like the acting in this film is pretty incredible. I have this special kind of like connection with Elle Fanning. I've been a huge fan of her ever since Super 8 came out. It came out when I was like 12 or so, and it is about these kids doing a Super 8 film, and I was so obsessed and in love with it. So yeah, that's just a little bit of sidetrack there. It really much focuses on his relationship with Suze or Sylvie and how he then goes on to go to Europe, and after his initial flop with this record of covers that he did, his career starts to pick up when he writes these really socially conscious songs, and then he starts having an affair with Joan Baez, which I feel like is a really important part of his life and also of the film. And then there's like the scene that really much makes the whole story of the film, and that is him at the Newport Jazz Festival. So this actually happened. It is pretty well documented actually. He went on stage and he went electric. This is like this famous moment, and it is really interesting because the moment that he starts playing electric, a lot of his fans really do not like it. They want his old music back, and I felt this was so interesting because everyone loved this song, The Times They Are Changing, but when they were really changing, no one seemed to like it. But yeah, that is kind of like what the film is about. It ends with him leaving Newport on his motorcycle. But now let's talk about the costumes. So the costumes were done by Arianne Philipps. She's a costume designer from the US, and she has done the costumes for several films. She has worked so much ever since the 1990s. However, there are two films that particularly stick out to me, and that is Walk the Line and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because they're both set in sort of the same time frame. It's also pretty interesting because the director James Mangold has also directed Girl Interrupted, which is just a personal favorite of mine, but even more interestingly, Walk the Line, the film about June Carter and Johnny Cash, a film that I really adore and a film where I felt like the costumes were done really well too. Arianne Philipps even had an Academy Award nomination for her work on Walk the Line, and I personally really adored it. I have to say, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood has me super split because I felt like there were some costumes that were done really well. I, for example, really adored how Ray Dalton, this character played by Leonardo DiCaprio, was wearing this kind of like older 60s style to kind of like show his heyday time is now far gone. I really love how they portrayed some of the extras like the mamas and the papas and a lot of the costumes on Sharon Tate too. However, there's this one outfit, I feel like this has been talked about by a couple of people, where she wears this like shirt and these denim cutoffs, and I feel like that's just really modern looking. It looks like a Forever 21 outfit basically. But I have to say, overall, I did really like her work, so I was excited to see what she came up with for this movie. Overall, I feel like the costumes are really accurate. I really like what they did, where they went. I read an interview with Arianne where she said that she herself is a big Dylan fan, which I feel like you can definitely see because this whole movie is like a love letter to him, basically. Even though I felt like generally in the movie they did not go too much into like his mind and everything, he was just portrayed a little further distant, which I don't know how to feel about, but that was the choice that they made. And she did a lot of research, which really shows in the film. She obviously knew a lot about the late 1960s from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. However, the 1960s were such a fast-changing time in fashion that I felt like it was really interesting to see her take on the early and mid-1960s because the fashion was truly different. One thing that I adored is how the film is set through and through in the time that it lives in. Not even a single extra feels out of place. I feel like they did such a great job. Also with the production design in general, I really adored it. I felt like it felt really authentic, and I know that for the costumes and everything, they tried to copy a lot of the things. Fortunately, this time of Dylan is actually really well documented, and so they had a lot to work with, and I felt like they did a great job. Also, don't worry, I'm gonna talk about specific looks. I just want to get like an overall feeling over first. I also felt like his hair was done really well. I know that this isn't particularly the costume, but I felt like it really added to his look. The hair and makeup was done by Jamie Lee McIntosh, who did a great job. She and Arianne Philipps had worked together before on Don't Worry Darling, but I really liked how they did the hair, makeup, and costume there too. One more thing that impressed me a lot was how many outfits he wore. He wore close to 70 outfits from what I saw and what I read, which I thought was really interesting because it is a huge undertaking to take that on. So Bob Dylan's transformation is kind of like parted into 3 parts, which you can clearly see in the wardrobe. The first part is his arrival in New York. That was around 1961 and 1962. Then there's the freewheeling era, which was around 1963 to 1964, and then it ends with his like slim mod silhouette and his new style and music style when he went to the Newport Jazz Festival in 1965. And I felt like this was really nicely transported because in the early 60s, the beginning of the film, he wore this like really loose and oversized silhouette that was pretty popular, and then as the mid 60s and the breakout of the mod scene starts to come into play, and he also went to Europe, he really much adapts this modern silhouette of tighter pants and just like takes elements from mod style into his wardrobe. But now let's talk about some looks that I loved in particular. So in the beginning of the film, he's this man from Minnesota coming to New York, and he meets Woody Guthrie, and he just kind of like wants to be like him in a way, so he starts dressing like Woody Guthrie. So it's a lot of like 60s workwear. I almost want to say it's on the edge between like a hobo style and this kind of like 60s workwear look with a lot of carpenter pants and just like leather jackets, turtlenecks, these kind of hats. It also does have this really slight Beatnik influence, which I like because Bob Dylan was very intertwined with the Beatnik scene, something that is not shown that much in the film, but something that I, as a Dylan fan, have always found quite interesting. And I feel like his connection with Jack Kerouac and the entire Beatnik scene is something that, first of all, got him his like literature Nobel Prize later, which is something I don't even want to go there because I still think what he did and the way that he treated that was kind of like odd, because obviously he did not get this prize for himself. He also kind of got it for the entire Beatnik writer scene. He was just sort of the only one left. But yeah, that's for another day. But I felt like these kind of beatnik influences and this very low-key and laid-back style was portrayed quite nicely. I personally really love this look. This is from when he records an album. He's wearing this like brown turtleneck and this kind of hat that I have, and it has like a little button so it snaps up and down, something that I saw a lot with 1960s workwear. He's wearing a pair of Levi's jeans, which we're going to talk about a little more later on, because he actually wore a couple pair of Levi's denims throughout the film. They even did a collaboration in honor of the film, and I felt like what they did with them was super clever. The next look that is pretty popular is the freewheeling cover. It shows him with his then girlfriend Suze Rotolo. First of all, just on the topic, everyone is casted really well in this movie. I feel like look-wise, but also the way that they present themselves. The casting is done really well, and I personally felt like Elle Fanning did so well in the role of Sylvie Suze Rotolo. But this cover is really popular. I read about how it was actually taken, how they were just like walking down the street with their photographer friend, and he took this picture and they liked it, so they put it on the album cover. But it is clear to say how his style has evolved from his early days in New York. He's wearing a suede jacket and a classic pair of Levi's 501s, and it definitely starts to show his development towards a more stylish wardrobe. It's not as rooted in workwear anymore. It's definitely starting to get a lot more fashionable. The Levi's 501 stands for so much. It's such an interesting garment actually, because it stands for this entire youth rebellion of the late 50s and the early 1960s. So I felt like obviously this is what he originally wore, but also the choice of going with that for the beginning of the film was pretty clever, because it also shows this like young man starting his own journey, which is what this pair of pants really much stands for. I read that they did slight alterations and changes to this Levi's 501, and that it is supposed to be a slightly bit more skinny and straight than the modern one. But overall, you can still get a Levi's 501, and I feel like they're sort of the same. But keep in mind how he wore these Levi's 501s in the beginning of the film, because the next time that he will wear a pair of Levi's jeans, it's actually gonna be quite different. I really like this look too, because for me it reflects this like post-beatnik start to the folky scene kind of time, if that makes any sense. It's definitely starting to get a lot more stylish and dressier in a way. So in 1964, Dylan goes to Europe, where he meets the Beatles and Donovan, and it seems like he picks up a lot of that style actually, something that you could see in his actual real life. As said, these costumes are just insanely close to the actual reality, and I feel like he definitely takes on the mod look. He doesn't fully embrace it, but you can definitely see that it is highly influenced by that. There's this one scene from 1965 where he is recording in the studio and he's wearing this, and he is wearing denim too. These are also Levi's, but now they're a lot slimmer, so this definitely shows how now he has grown into this stylish persona. He's also now wearing sunglasses, which I found particularly interesting, because I felt like the movie did a really clever thing where, starting with the moment where he kind of like got famous and his career picked up, he started to wear a lot of sunglasses, which I really like because it shows his public persona drifting a little away from his like personal life. I really liked how they made this dissection visible with the sunglasses. I also adore the shoes that he's wearing. These Chelsea boots with the pretty high heel were popularized by the Beatles. I think they're originally riding boots. My husband wore a pair like that on our wedding day. They're just so beautiful. It's a pair of shoes and a silhouette that I really adore on men. His hair is bigger. He wears this striped shirt, and it is just way more stylish and way more rooted in like the popular trends of the mid-1960s than what we saw in his earlier time, which for me also reflected how in the beginning he wasn't famous, he wasn't there where like everything was happening in a way, and so he just kind of like wore this laid back style, and now he's going with the trends. He is making the trends in a way, and he's just like at the pulse of time. He has these fans that adore him. It's overall going quite well for him at this point. It seems like he is finding himself a lot more during this time and like the time leading up to the Newport Festival. He seems to be getting a lot more confident in who he is, his music, and that reflects in his style. It really seems like with his looks, he is resisting categorization, which he does with his music when he goes to the Newport Festival, but also with his style, because it is ever changing. And I adore how the film emphasized that, because we obviously know so much more than where the film goes. We know what he did in the 70s and 80s, how he painted his face white, how he did all of these changes. So I felt like it was really cleverly done to include that, even though the movie's span and like time it plays in is so short. So yes, he starts wearing tailored suits and polka dot shirts like this one. This one actually is an exact replica. As said, I read this interview with the costume designer and she said how they had several pieces handmade and just like perfectly made after the original. It's interesting because this kind of style is very European for the mid-60s, which is also interesting for someone who does folk music because that is rooted so deep in American society and it's like a very American kind of music. Like here in Europe, we do have that too, but it just sounds different. Folk music obviously exists everywhere, but the type of folk music he made was very American, so it's interesting that he started to dress really British. He got a lot of his shirts from Savile Row and Carnaby Street during this time. But I personally have to say the replica of this shirt is downright perfect, down to every buttonhole, down to everything. It's just the perfect shirt. Now let's talk about this pivotal moment in 1965 when Dylan goes electric. He goes on stage and he's wearing this like black leather jacket and this burnt orangey, almost pinky shirt. This is the moment where hell breaks loose, and what I found really interesting is that he's wearing this like leather jacket with it, and it's a shiny black leather jacket. By this point we've seen him wear leather jackets a lot in the film, but everything was suede, and as he starts going electric, as he kind of like embarks on this new journey, as he makes this step towards this new kind of music, the type of leather he wears changes, which I think is really, really clever. Shiny leather is very much associated with the mods and the space age movement of the 60s, but I also feel like it is very much associated with like a lot of the 80s rock and everything that came, a lot of the electric music that he started, and so I felt like that was a really clever move. I don't know if he made it intentionally back in the day, but I felt like highlighting this outfit was really clever for the trajectory of the film. But obviously there are more characters to this film. There are more wonderful people, and the beautiful fashion doesn't start and end with Bob Dylan. There's so much more. Obviously Suze Rotolo or Sylvie in the film, and then Joan Baez also play key parts, and their fashion is pretty impressive to me. So there's this look that Joan Baez wears to the Newport Festival, and it is very well remade. It just honestly feels really real to me. Joan had this unique style, this like purist kind of style. It was also really almost like conservative in a way, like compared to a lot of the short skirts of the 1960s, her style was definitely a lot more conservative with this like pleated skirt, but it just really works so well within the film. So I really like this outfit. I think the original like dress, or maybe it's a shirt with a skirt, was also remade, but then there's also this look of them performing together, and I think that this dress is actually vintage, something that I found really interesting because when you look at the film, I feel like it is really hard to tell what is replica and what is vintage, and for me that is kind of like the master stroke of this film. I feel like the time feels so real in this movie because they have this combination of pieces that are actually from the time, that have the patina, that are actually made during that time without the possibility of having like modern tools and modern ways of making clothes. And then they also replicated some of the very well documented and like the outfits, like for example the Newport outfits that are just so well known throughout pictures. But I felt like this was such a clever move. And for example, this dress I found was really interesting because I don't want to say a bone to pick, but here's the thing with paisley. There's a lot of modern paisley, and for me it never looks right. I know this sounds so odd, but I have seen so many replica paisley pieces and nothing ever exactly looks like how they did it back then. I don't know how and why that is the case. I can just tell you that for me that's the case, and I felt like they did such a good job combining these pieces and making it feel so real. There is also, and I tried to find a picture of this like vinyl leather thing that she wears, like a coat, and I read about it in the interview with the costume designer Arianne Philipps, where she said that they found a picture of Joan Baez wearing that, and she did so much research and she had no idea where it was from, but they eventually found out that it was a Mary Quant design, which had me smiling so much because obviously she was like one of the people really putting this like vinyl fabric to the forefront in the 1960s. And so she actually was able to track down one of these coats. So I felt like that was really cool to be featured in the film. She said that it isn't the original color. However, I feel like that doesn't really matter, because for me, with this film, it's not about copying every single look down to every single detail, which they did fabulously with some of the looks. But like generally, it's about transporting the time. It's about transporting the feeling. It is about showing how these people were, what they wore, and it isn't about getting every single detail right. For me, it's a lot about the feel of the time and how they did such a good job making it feel so authentic by choosing to go with so many vintage pieces. Next up is this look. Sylvie Sue's Rotolo, she wears it. I adore it. I also really love how she was wearing all of these like baggier jeans, these like very straight cut jeans, because it was something so new for women to do in the early 60s, and I always thought it was really impressive that she just went ahead with it. One of my favorites is this jacket that she wears, and when I did a Google search about it, I got so many like ads to buy this jacket, and so I clicked on a couple because I felt like maybe someone replicated it. Maybe it is like a clothing piece from a brand like the Hippie Shake or some of these like popular 1960s brands. I felt like that could have really well been the case. However, it did look really, really originally and like very authentically 60s to me. And all the links brought me to like the worst Shein knockoff looks of that, so don't do that. And so when I read the article, I read that this is actually a vintage jacket, a Romanian vintage jacket that they picked up, I think on eBay for $100, which is great because if you look at the picture, it's not the identical, like not the complete identical look, and that is what I was just saying earlier, how it does have the right look. It doesn't matter that the original one had like not the embroidery on the sleeves and then it had like the fur go all the way around the trim on the bottom edge. That doesn't matter because you look at the picture and then you look at Elle Fanning in the film and you can see that it is the same look. I feel like that was really well done. As said, generally this mix of vintage and modern is incredible because I feel like this jacket, I've seen a lot of these like Penny Lane Afghan jackets from the 60s recreated, and to me none of them do really get it right. A lot of them do look really authentic, but for me I have never seen one where I was like, oh, is this actually from the 60s? I don't know, there's just this like very, very specific way that they made these jackets back then. I also do think that they did a great job with a lot of the other costumes. There's this really simple look by Johnny Cash that I feel like is also really well copied. I feel like this was just like a home run for Arianne Philipps after doing Walk the Line because she probably did extensive research on Johnny Cash for that too. But I like how they went with this really laid back look of him as well because yes, it is really well documented, but also this time of his career, he was wearing that a lot, so I felt like that felt really real. So to kind of like summarize this, I think that the film did a lot right. I think they did a really good job at mixing and balancing vintage and vintage-inspired pieces and just being able to make it feel really cohesive throughout the film and really making it feel like the early to mid 1960s. I feel like that was a really great job and a really clever way to make the costumes for a film like that, because with like all these biopics and a lot of them set in the 60s and 70s, I feel like when you only go with replicated outfits, it is really hard to catch that original 1960s feeling. So I really adored how they made the choice to do both, because I know it is a lot of work as someone who does a lot of research and like tries to hunt down specific vintage pieces. It is a lot of work. It's probably a lot easier with like a big movie budget to just go to a tailor and be like, we need this, this, and this. But it also does so much for the film as it just looks so incredibly authentic. I have given the overall idea of a biopic and the way that it kind of like works with fashion a lot of thoughts, because I feel like on one hand it makes it easier. Like for example, the Newport Jazz Festival looks, obviously there's so much there. There's so much, it's so well documented. You see all of these looks, you know this is what they wore. But then I feel like it also makes it harder to show specific things about a character, if that makes sense. However, I feel like they did a really good job because they replicated the looks at like the Newport Jazz Festival, because obviously that's really well documented. The Freewheeling album cover would have been weird if they would have worn something different. But then for the scenes that are kind of like set outside of the public eye, the scenes that are not as well documented, they did a really good job at choosing costumes that go really well with the ones that are replica looks. I feel like they balanced that incredibly well. I feel like also the fact that Bob Dylan's style changed so much from the early to the mid-1960s did the film a great favor. It just made it visually really interesting. And I also feel like they did a great job representing that. Overall, you can see I really adored the way that they did the fashion for this film. There's not a lot negative for me to say about it. But yeah, I feel like it's nice to just spread some positivity. Usually I feel like when people review things, a lot of the time they're not as happy about what they got or what they saw as I am right now. For me personally, the film could have gone a little more into depth. It could have gone a little more into like the mind of Bob Dylan. I feel like it was really much told from the outside, but as said, that's like a directorial choice. You decide to tell the story that way, and I think that that's perfectly fine. I just hope that one day we get like another Bob Dylan biopic that maybe focuses a little more on his mind. I always felt like there's this film called Inside Llewyn Davis by the Coen brothers that is about this like struggling musician in the early 60s, and I always felt like this is loosely based on Bob Dylan, but this film is very much in the head. It's very much about the mind of this guy, so yeah, maybe something like that. But then also, I don't know, Bob Dylan has never written a biography himself, so who really knows what went on in his head? One final thing that I want to say is that a lot of the time when I see films set in the 60s and 70s, they do get a lot right, but they usually fail at getting the exact year. Like usually when they say this film is set in 1965, they have some pieces from 65 and earlier, but then they also put in some pieces that just got like popular in 66 or 67 because fashion was changing so fast in the time. And I feel like the film did a great job at actually capturing the time and the changing fashion of the years with really pinning down what trend emerged in which year and what really worked, not only for their characters, but also for the overall narrative of the film. So that is it. That is it for this video. Let me know if you would like to see more reviews. I'm usually hesitant to share my opinion on the internet. I have a little bit of trauma there. I don't want to call it trauma because as someone who has actual trauma, I don't have trauma in that way. I just have a bad experience because I once posted about Yoko Ono and how I don't think she broke up the Beatles, and hell broke loose. So I don't know, but I feel like on YouTube people are a lot more kinder. And then also this new year, I want to make content that I really enjoy. Like I have done that in the last years, but I feel like I played it safe, and whenever I had an idea that may have been a little more risky, I decided not to do it because I didn't dare, but this year I'm gonna dare. So yeah, maybe there are more reviews of films and wardrobes in the future. Let me know what you thought. Let me know what you thought about the film and the wardrobe. I would love to know it. But yeah, that is it. I'm gonna continue to sip my coffee now, and then also continue to get inspired by Bob Dylan's fashion. This I feel like is a very Bob Dylan inspired look. Obviously I accessorized with jewelry, but I don't know, after seeing all these images from the film, I just have to say he had a great style overall. He was a really stylish person, so I felt like for them to show that through the movie was a really cool thing. For me, the production design and costume design of the film just really felt like a love letter. I think I said that earlier, but it really felt like a love letter to this time and the music. But yeah, I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine. Take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls!